In this Napoleonic world at war, it's the airships that turn the story from a historical fantasy to a steampunk science fiction story. And the airship that takes us through our story is the two-gun Chaucer airship Mistral. She's a rigid airship with a frame of plywood and made lighter than air with Luftgas, a fictional name for real-life helium, as opposed to other airships in flammable air, which is real-life hydrogen, and is ballasted and balanced using movable bags of sand or other discrete stores. Mistral is propelled using a steam boiler, burning liquid fuel, and turning a steamjack, which is a real-life steam turbine that turns air-screw propellers. Mistral fulfills her role as a chasseur with two muzzle-loading breath guns, pointing forward and muzzle-loading muskets or rifles for her crew to fire. When we're first introduced to Mistral and the airships of this world in general, we get a detailed view of the intricacies of handling, outfitting, and preparing an airship for flight, and then for battle. Later on, under the guise of a flight trial and crew training, we also get descriptions of how the airship is flown and fought in combat, just as a start before the war comes home to our characters. In the hangar, before Mistral gets outfitted for war, the primary concern is not damaging the vessel before it gets to perform. As portrayed in story, the plywood frame of Mistral is rather delicate, and not uniquely so among airships, as carelessness from dock workers can apparently damage the structure even without intending to, as Josette has to shout down one individual before he causes said damage. This is true to life where, depending on how lightly a structure has to be made to reduce weight and still make the strength requirement, there's not much room for a safety factor. Excess strength that can protect against unexpected forces. A structural member that can take the expected load, but is too small and light to take much more, can easily be damaged, and the load that member took has to be shared among other load-bearing members. With a near non-existent safety factor, this is a prime setup for a cascade of structural failure that can destroy a ship. In story, this very nearly happens with Mistral, as the force of turning the airship hard over nearly takes off her tail, and compromising her airworthiness. Throughout the story, we see the crew inspecting, repairing, and reinforcing members as they become damaged under loads, both expected and inflicted by flight and fighting actions. Also starting in the hangar, outfitting Mistral with her boiler and steamjack demands care be taken to properly mount them. We see Josette inspect and then adjust the fasteners on the boiler as it's installed. After all, it's important that the pressure vessel the airship needs for its propulsion is actually able to take the pressure without flying apart. We see what happens when this is compromised when the scout ship Mistral first engages explodes in midair upon failure of its steamjack, as the unreleased pressure turns their boiler into a bomb. This relates to the real-life understanding of using fastener hardware when literally screwing together components for a machine. The fasteners of parts under load require a certain level of torque to be considered safe for normal operation. Too loose, and the fastener may come off on its own, no longer fastening anything. Too tight, and the force of operation may put such a stress on the threads that the threads themselves break, so the fastener is, again, no longer fastening anything. Given the pressure requirements of a high-temperature, high-pressure boiler needing to propel an airship, Josette is well to be concerned that every single fastener is properly torqued as needed. Even when flying Mistral or any airship like her, care must be taken as to when and how to safely make maneuvers. That's because whenever performance is presumed or improved, it is not safe to make the same maneuvers in all conditions. As seen in story, a hard turn at slow speed is decidedly less hazardous to the ship than the same hard turn at higher airspeeds. Part of the story involves testing the strength of Mistral's airframe when turning at high speed, and the inadequate original construction fails under load and nearly dooms the ship to destruction. After properly repairing and reinforcing the structure, only then can Mistral take advantage of its structure's unique advantages and use her speed and turning performance to outfly and outfight her airship enemies. Before I continue, I want to point out something I noticed I think would be fun to consider. When I was rereading the book, I learned that the name Mistral refers to a real-life wind phenomenon that occurs over the southern coast of France. It's a northwesterly wind that brings a uniquely clear climate to that region of France when it comes around in the winter and spring. What's funny is that when I read this story years ago, I didn't know this about the name Mistral. I kept mistaking it for the term minstrel, with an N. That's the name of the medieval court and later street musician. And however incongruous you may think this of me, I thought it fit the story neatly. After all, as a revolutionary new design, Josette and other characters at first have little faith that they won't die in a crash for some damn fool engineer's mistakes. It would have made sense to me that the people who constructed the airship may have had little faith that whoever was unlucky enough to crew this airship would survive long enough to extol its virtues as a flying fighting machine. So calling the airship minstrel would basically be saying that its creation was a fickle indulgence to the engineers perpetually trying to cheat nature. At the same time, it would make sense that the Gharnian military administration would assign Josette, the first woman captain of a king's airship, the minstrel, as basically saying it's to indulge the king in his fancy of integrating women into the Gharnian military. Alas, whether as minstrel or mistral, Josette's command is a bona fide asset to her military, even if the higher-ups are too self-important and complacent to recognize it. On that note, the roles airships serve in this world seem to be purposefully placed under the inauspicious title of Aerial Signal Corps, which indicates that airships are mainly for aerial signaling between military command and units. While it would certainly be an important job and an advantage to commanding and controlling armies in the field, as can be seen in the climatic battle, airships in story have even more roles that can validate their use, and not just as disposable on the whim of traditional noble leaders. What we see the most is airships as scouts, pickets, and chasseurs, which is French for hunter. And mentioned also are bombers as well. Ignoring the non-indicative name, the roles of airships are already expanding in story beyond merely aerial signaling, and in a similar way to real-life aircraft first used in war. When World War I saw the first use of airplanes, they were first confined to sighting enemies and spotting for artillery fire. Of course, they weren't confined to those roles for long, as it became important to destroy enemy spotters, and then arm planes to protect the spotters, and then increase performance to go after enemies, and additionally, using aircraft to drop ordnance directly on targets, both on the battlefield and on wartime resources behind the lines. In story, Mistral is written as the latest evolution of the airship as a fighting platform, carrying an uncommon armament of 2 guns as opposed to the more common 1 gun on other chasseurs. As naval-style turrets would be too heavy to attempt placement on an airship, as of the technology level in story, chasseurs target their enemies with their guns by pointing as straight toward them as possible. Speed and maneuverability then become important performance parameters for a chasseur to outfly and attack enemies. Of course, Mistral is not limited to just her guns against airships. Her crew can also directly shoot enemy personnel with muskets or rifles, and can target soldiers on the ground using her guns, and also fused bombs. In-universe bombers may be like Mistral, but dedicated solely to dropping fused charges on helpless enemies. Chasseurs then would have an equally pressing role of protecting armies from high-flying bombers. Dedicated scouts, or bigger airships used as scouts, then have the role of finding enemy formations and relaying the information back to military command. Given the inefficiency of firearms and artillery for elevating upward and targeting airships for destruction, the scout airships don't have to be heavily reinforced against enemy fire to simply rise high above, avoid destruction, gather information, and then relay that information back to Allied units. Indeed, the scout over Durham that Mistral encounters was unfortunate and perhaps foolish for being caught so low to the ground, but was indeed well advised to gain as much height as possible as fast as possible. Above a certain height, the primary threat to an airship is no longer ground fire, but enemy airship attack. As the airships portrayed can only have their guns below their envelope in the Hurricane deck, getting above an enemy airship is the surest way to avoid artillery fire. For a chasseur hunting airships, getting above them is also the surest way to get the most possible range and striking power out of shots fired. It's also why concealment and misdirection while flying in clouds is also an important tactic of airship-based combat. The part that's dubious is the ability to detect and track airships by sound within the clouds. Even with the steamjack and air screws disengaged, the hearing of aircrew would likely degrade to the point of uselessness to that particular end. It's still a thrilling idea of portraying cat and mouse among the clouds. As much as realism is portrayed and well justified in the universe and story of The Guns Above, there are numerous items, substances, and technologies that are quite anachronistic with the rest of the rustic, wilderness-dominated world of Garnia. Most of these out-of-place technologies are on the airships and Mistral in particular. Steamjacks are, as mentioned previously, steam-driven turbine engines that provide the motive force for airship propulsion, and the steam comes from a boiler that is likely a fire tube boiler, fueled and pressurized by the burning of liquid fuel. Kerosene is mentioned in story, so that is likely a candidate for fueling the airship, as coal would be far too heavy and take too much space to carry with the airship to go very far. Josette mentions that an internal combustion engine, like real-life engines, may be in the works for future airship propulsion, and that would mainly have to make use of liquid fuels, such as kerosene, given the correctly designed combustion cycle. What makes steamjacks and kerosene both anachronistic for the depicted world is that both require advanced metallurgy to withstand the heat and pressure, and advanced processes to refine crude petroleum into component substances, including kerosene. Even the extraction of helium or Luftgas requires an extensive infrastructure that goes hand in hand with petroleum extraction and refining, and in particular the extraction of natural gas, as that's where most of real-life helium is extracted en masse. As an aside, if Garnia could indeed extract helium from natural gas deposits, then extracting natural gas would be useful as a fuel for propelling the airship, given that it's far closer to air density, and wouldn't excessively lighten the airship upon burning, unlike kerosene. Stranger still is that the Garnian army indeed has generators, ostensibly to produce inflammable air or hydrogen. It's strange because the main ways to produce hydrogen are steam reformation, which uses steam acting on petroleum to produce hydrogen, or electrolysis, which uses a voltage to decompose water into hydrogen and oxygen. Either the generators store steam and petroleum to produce hydrogen, or they use petrochemical fuel to turn electric generators to decompose water and make the hydrogen. If the Guardian military has generators of either sort, between petrofuels, internal combustion engines, and electric generators, it's strange to consider that those technologies are not finding larger use in industrial and military application. The rather crude production of inflammable air in the field may also explain the portrayed volatility of an airship filled with the gas in story. It would mean that the production of hydrogen is regularly and easily contaminated by outside air, making easily explosive mixtures that can be extremely hazardous to a small blimp. With such a detailed look into how airship operations may play out in the fictional world of The Guns Above, some real-life knowledge of aviation technology can provide an inspiration for how airships may benefit in real life. For just a few examples, as a first, the Mistral's plywood rigid airframe could benefit from the real-life airframe construction style called geodesic or geodetic, which combined lateral and longitudinal spars into a cross lattice that distributed the stresses on the frame, such that the failure of a substantial number of members could be supported by the remainder. The design is such that the larger it gets, the greater the overall strength and redundancy of the system. Not only would it allow for a sturdier construction, the members could be made lighter, or take advantage of materials with greater strength-to-weight ratios, and be more easily replaced, reinforced, or repaired, depending on the material. The extensive fire prevention and mitigation practices and procedures demonstrated in story would be well served if the airship could take advantage of the extra lifting capacity of hydrogen. Just as a recap, the Mistral survived massive fires on her outer envelope that the crew survived by cutting away the burning skin. They were the kind of massive fires that would have certainly doomed any airship and crew less proficient and less practiced in fighting fires. Assuming the hydrogen is not extensively contaminated with oxygen as the in-universe inflammable air, the crew would at least gain the ability to vent gas when ballast or other weights are dumped overboard, and not be burdened with the need for speed to make up the difference. When venting helium lift gas is not an economic option, hydrogen would be a savior of both money and reputation. The use of a steam turbine to propel an airship can be further developed and useful in real life in the way that turbine engines are useful today for generating electric or motive power on waterborne ships. With a construction both lightweight and tolerant of high temperature and pressure, a steam turbine would be more efficient than an internal combustion engine utilizing the same pressure and temperatures. Whereas the Steamjack in story directly drives the air screws through a gearbox, likely manual, a real turbine could be used to generate electrical power for electric motor-driven propellers. The boiler for such a turbine could, instead of being a pressurized fire tube boiler, could be a better optimized water tube boiler, where there is significantly less risk of explosive failure. As an aside, a scene I found amusing was Firen's and Gaston's incredulous mocking of Josette taking off and replacing air screws to make Mistral fly faster. Going from 6 slow-spinning, large-diameter, two-bladed air screws to 4 fast-spinning, smaller-diameter, 4-bladed air screws. Gaston joked that maybe Josette would have gone even faster had she taken off all the air screws. I found it funny because when jet turbine aircraft started flying and outspeeding propeller-driven aircraft, it did indeed seem magical at first that these jet aircraft essentially lost their propellers and somehow went even faster. Indeed, jet turbines are a logical extension of making air screws both smaller and faster spinning, such that they provide yet even greater high-speed thrust. I just like to imagine Firen and Gaston comprehending such an engineering development. They would richly deserve their befuddlement. The point of these inspirational notions is that just by comprehending the nitty-gritty of airship operations as portrayed in story, it makes the possible real-life advancement of technology that could be applied to airships seem a bit less mystifying, as less pie in the sky, and more achievable. If flying an airship from that sacred captain's spot on the hurricane deck can brighten even Josette's disposition, we should hope to enjoy airship flying at least that much.